She was a rising star in the world of law, but one betrayal shattered everything she believed in. 2 years later, her ex-fiancé reappears, homeless, desperate, and then. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe for more stories. The dim glow of the bedside lamp cast soft amber light across the room, illuminating Elena's delicate wedding gown hanging on the wall. Its ivory lace shimmered like a promise of purity and love. She sat on the edge of her bed, smoothing her hands over the silk of her robe, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. Tomorrow she would marry Marco, the man she had loved for 5 years, the man she believed had been crafted by fate just for her. Her cousin Isabel lay sprawled on the armchair nearby, scrolling through her phone with a look of casual boredom. Her long auburn hair was wrapped in a towel, and she wore one of Elena's spare robes, fresh from the shower. The faint scent of rose water lingered in the air. "Relax, Elena," Isabel drawled, not looking up from her phone. "You're acting like you're being marched to your execution. You're going to be a beautiful bride. Marco won't be able to take his eyes off you." Elena smiled faintly, pulling her knees up to her chest. I know. It's just nerves. Big changes always come with a little fear, right?" She stared at the gown, her mind drifting into thoughts of walking down the aisle, her parents' proud smiles, and Marco's face when he would finally see her. "Don't overthink it," Isabel said, glancing up with a teasing grin. "Tomorrow you'll be Mrs. Elena DeLank. It's every girl's dream, isn't it?" Elena laughed lightly, resting her chin on her knees. "I suppose. I just want it to be perfect." Isabel rose from the chair, stretching her arms with a loud yawn. "Well, perfect brides need their beauty sleep. I'm going to rinse off real quick before bed." She grabbed a small bag from the chair and disappeared into the bathroom, leaving the door slightly ajar. The sound of running water echoed softly through the apartment. Elena exhaled, letting her body relax for the first time that night. She reached for the television remote but paused as something caught her eye: Isabel's phone, left face up on the coffee table. A soft vibration buzzed and the screen lit up with a message notification. At first, Elena glanced over it absently, but her eyes froze on the message preview. "Marco, can't wait to see you one last time before tomorrow." Her breath caught in her throat. Her heart skipped once, then pounded harder, faster, like an alarm bell inside her chest. Her fingers hovered over the phone, her mind already racing with explanations. "It's probably innocent," she told herself. "Maybe he meant Isabel and Marco were planning a surprise for me. Maybe they're just meeting quickly to finalize something for the wedding." But deep down, a small, sharp doubt whispered otherwise. Before she could stop herself, she picked up Isabel's phone. Her thumb hovered over the lock screen, then tapped it. To her shock, there was no password. Isabel never set one. Her stomach twisted with guilt, but her curiosity, no, her instinct, compelled her. She opened the messaging app. Marco's name was at the top of the conversation list. With trembling fingers, she tapped it. Her world collapsed. There in front of her was a thread of messages stretching back for weeks. Her eyes darted from one message to the next. "Marco, you looked incredible last night. I can't stop thinking about you. Isabel, you'll have to be patient, lover boy. Tomorrow I'm all yours. Marco, tomorrow feels like an eternity. Meet me tonight, yeah?" Her breath came in shallow gasps as her eyes continued downward, disbelief giving way to cold, jagged reality. Then the final blow: photos. Grainy but unmistakable. Marco's face, leaning in close to Isabel's, lips barely apart. Another photo of them in a dimly lit room, Isabel's hand cradling his face with an intimacy that could never be mistaken for friendship. Elena's heart stopped. Her vision blurred with tears, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped the phone. Her breath came in uneven gasps. No. She blinked hard, as though doing so would erase what she'd just seen. Her chest tightened, and for a brief second, it felt like the world was suffocating her. Her fingers tightened around the phone like it was the only solid thing in the world. Her wedding dress swayed gently on its hanger as though mocking her. Beautiful, pure, and untouched. Everything this marriage is not. The bathroom door opened. Steam poured out, followed by Isabel still drying her hair with a towel. She hummed to herself, unaware of the storm about to hit. She glanced up, still rubbing the towel over her hair. Her eyes met Elena's, and her smile faltered when she saw the phone in her cousin's hand. "Elena?" Isabel's tone shifted. Her eyes darted from the phone to Elena's face. "What are you doing with my—" "How long, Isabel?" Elena's voice was low, like the rumble of distant thunder before a storm. Her face was flushed with rage, tears brimming in her eyes. "What?" Isabel asked, playing dumb, but the nervous twitch in her brow betrayed her. "Don't play innocent with me." Elena stood, her voice cracking like a whip. She shoved the phone toward Isabel. "How long have you been sleeping with Marco?" "How long, Isabel? Tell me." "It's not what you think," Isabel started, her voice rising in pitch, eyes wild with panic. "Don't you dare lie to me." Elena's voice thundered. Her hand slammed the table, rattling the mugs and dishes. "My cousin. My sister. You knew I loved him, Isabel. You knew, and you still did this to me." Isabel's eyes darted to the door as if planning an escape. "You don't understand, Elena. It's not that simple." "Not that simple?" Elena laughed, tears spilling down her face, equal parts heartbreak and fury. "Do you know what I was doing tonight, Isabel? I was imagining walking down the aisle toward the man I thought loved me. I was praying that everything would be perfect tomorrow. I was hoping, Isabel. Do you even know what that feels like anymore?" Isabel took a step forward, hands raised as if calming a wild animal. "Look, I'm sorry, okay? I didn't plan for this to happen. It just happened." Elena's eyes narrowed into slits. Her voice came low, dangerous. "If you say, 'It just happened,' one more time, I swear, Isabel, I will never forgive you." At that moment there was a knock on the door. Both women froze. Elena's eyes darted to Isabel, whose face had gone pale. Her hands fidgeted nervously. "Elena, it's me," a familiar voice called from the other side. "Marco." Elena's eyes widened with disbelief, then something inside her snapped. She strode to the door, threw it open, and there he stood, tall, confident, with the audacity to smile at her. "Hey, She didn't let him finish. Her hand connected with his face in a loud, sharp slap that echoed through the room. Marco's head snapped to the side, his jaw hanging in stunned silence. "Don't you dare say a word," she hissed, her voice deathly calm. Her chest heaved as she glared at him with a fury that could set the world on fire. "I saw the messages, Marco. I saw everything. You think I'm blind? You think I wouldn't find out?" He rubbed his cheek, his eyes wide with shock. "Elena, it's not like that." "Out." Her voice was cold as ice. Her eyes cut into him like daggers. "Out of my house, out of my life, and out of my future." "Elena, listen please. I love you, I made a mistake. Get out." She pointed at the door, her entire body trembling. Her voice didn't shake. "Not this time." He hesitated, eyes darting toward Isabel, but she stood frozen, silent. She offered no comfort, no excuse. Marco glanced between the two women, his lips parting as if to speak, but something about Elena's face stopped him. He stepped backward. One step. Then another. And then he was gone. Elena closed the door slowly, hands still shaking. She leaned against it, exhaling slowly, her heart pounding in her ears. For a moment there was only silence. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Isabel whispered. Elena didn't look at her. "Get out, Isabel." Tears streamed down Isabel's face. But she didn't argue. She gathered her things and left. Elena stood alone, the wedding dress swaying on the hanger. She wiped her tears away. Her gaze hardened. The wedding was off. The old Elena died that night. 6 months had passed, but it might as well have been a lifetime. Elena stood in front of the courtroom, her gaze steady and unwavering as she faced the judge, the defense attorney, and the room filled with tense silence. Her black, form-fitting suit reflected her new persona, sleek, sharp, and utterly impenetrable. Her long dark hair was pulled back into a low, severe bun, leaving no room for softness. "The evidence is irrefutable, Your Honor," Elena declared, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Her eyes locked onto the defendant, a middle-aged executive from Altara Industries, charged with laundering millions through offshore accounts. The man's lawyer tried to look composed, but his jaw twitched at every word she spoke. Elena's heels echoed as she took slow, deliberate steps toward the jury. Her every movement was calculated, every glance purposeful. Her presence demanded attention, and no one in the courtroom dared to look away. "This man," she gestured toward the defendant with a slight tilt of her head, "believes that his wealth, his connections, and his title make him untouchable. He believes that people like us, like you," she pointed at the jury, "will look at his expensive suit and his well-rehearsed apologies and see a man worthy of sympathy." Her eyes scanned each juror, making sure they felt the weight of her words. "But today I'm here to tell you that no one is untouchable. Not him. Not anyone. Justice doesn't care how many zeros you have in your bank account. And neither do I." A ripple of quiet murmurs spread through the courtroom. Elena felt the shift, that subtle change in the air that told her she had them. The judge's gavel struck twice to call for silence. She didn't flinch. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she continued, her voice steady and unwavering, "you have the power to send a message today. You have the power to tell every corrupt executive hiding behind company logos and boardroom doors that their time is up. Make no mistake, justice will find them. I will find them." She paused for just a moment, letting her words linger like smoke in the air. Then she turned slowly, walking back to her seat. Not a glance toward the defendant. Not a glance toward his lawyer. They didn't deserve it. Her boss, Victor Kraus, leaned over as she sat down, his grin barely hidden behind his hand. "You really love making them sweat, don't you?" Elena raised an eyebrow, adjusting the cuff of her sleeve. "If they're sweating, I'm doing my job." Hours later, back at the office, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Desks were cluttered with legal briefs, folders marked urgent, in bold red, and half-empty cups of caffeine-fueled survival. Elena's office, however, remained pristine. Not a paper out of place. Not a speck of dust on her shelves. The only sign of personal touch was a small framed photo of her parents during their 30th anniversary. Her assistant, Sophia, knocked twice before entering, balancing a stack of case files on her hip. "Got a fresh load for you," she said, dropping the files onto the table with a loud thud. She glanced at Elena with a grin. "You sure you don't want to take a day off? Breathe some air that isn't recycled through a vent." "Breathing's overrated," Elena replied, eyes still fixed on her computer screen. She typed furiously, her fingers a blur. Sophia walked over, plopping herself onto the chair in front of Elena's desk. "You say that, but even machines need a break. Come on, just one weekend. I know a place that serves sangria so good it makes grown men weep." Elena snorted but kept typing. "Tempting, but I've got at least 10 grown men weeping in court right now. I think I'm covered." Sophia tilted her head, studying Elena. Her sharp features were tense, her jaw set like stone. Her eyes moved with laser-like focus, but there was something behind them. Something that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "Elena," Sophia said, voice softer this time. "You can't keep doing this." Elena's fingers stilled, her eyes slowly lifting from the screen to meet Sophia's. Her gaze was sharp, defensive. "Doing what?" "This." Sophia gestured at the room around them, at Elena herself. "Running yourself into the ground. Chasing every case like it's personal." "Because it is personal," Elena replied, her voice hard but quiet. Her eyes returned to her screen, her fingers resuming their rhythmic tapping. "Every case matters. Every single one of them." Sophia leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "Yeah, but not every case is yours to carry alone." Her voice was gentle but firm, the way a friend talks when they know you need to hear it. "You've built yourself into this unstoppable force. But I know you, Elena. You're still in there. You can't tell me that what happened with Marco didn't break something inside you." Elena stopped typing. Her fingers hovered over the keys like she'd forgotten what they were for. "You don't know what you're talking about, Sophia." Sophia sighed, leaning back in her chair. She crossed her arms but didn't argue. "All right, boss. Just don't let them win. The world's got enough people breaking themselves for people who aren't worth it." Her phone buzzed. Elena glanced at it briefly, ready to ignore it, until she saw the name. Gregor Weiss. Her heart gave a single hard thud. Her old mentor. She hadn't spoken to Gregor since she left his firm to work under Victor. He'd taken it personally, and their last words had been sharp. She didn't answer. Not yet. Later that evening, Elena sat at her desk, thumbing through files. Most of them were as dull as tax code, fraud, bribery, the usual suspects. But one file stopped her cold. The case involved a series of arrests linked to a human trafficking ring. Her eyes scanned the report, taking in names, aliases, known associates, and then she saw it. Reference provided by Gregor Weiss, Senior Legal Advisor. Her breath hitched. She flipped the page, heart pounding now. Why would Gregor Weiss be connected to this case? Her mentor was known for his polished reputation. Flawless, people called him. Too perfect. Her fingers traced his name on the paper, her thoughts swirling. Could be nothing. A coincidence. He might have provided legal services at some point, and his name just got added to the file. But her gut said otherwise. Her phone buzzed again, lighting up her desk. This time it wasn't Gregor calling. It was a message from Sophia. Sophia, got a weird lead on the Altara case. Check the attachment. Elena opened the message, scanning the attached document. Her eyes narrowed. It was a list of shell companies tied to offshore accounts. The names were different, but the structure was familiar. Her hands gripped the edge of her desk. Her mind ran the numbers, the connections. She'd seen this before, too many times. It was a pattern. Her eyes darted back to the file with Gregor Weiss's name. Her gaze grew cold, calculating. She reached for her phone and dialed Sophia. "Hey boss," Sophia answered on the second ring. "Pull everything we have on Gregor Weiss," Elena said, her tone sharp and direct. "Every case he's touched, every company he's advised, every account he's linked to. I want it all." There was a pause. "What's going on, Elena?" Elena's jaw tightened. "I'm following the scent of something rotten, Sophia. I want to see where it leads." Sophia didn't ask any more questions. "On it?" Elena hung up and sat back in her chair, eyes locked on Gregor's name. Her heart felt steady, but her mind was on fire. 6 months ago, she'd been a bride dreaming of love and family. That version of her was gone. Now there was only one thing she wanted: control. "Your move, Gregor," she whispered to no one but herself. Her phone buzzed once more. Another message. "Gregor Weiss, call me when you have a moment. We need to talk." Elena stared at the screen for a moment, then locked it without replying. "Not yet," she muttered, her eyes dark with resolve. "Not yet." The rain came down in thin, icy sheets, soaking everything in its path. Cobblestones shimmered under flickering streetlights as Marco shuffled along the narrow alley, his coat pulled tight around his thin frame. It wasn't much of a coat anymore, the seams frayed, buttons missing, fabric stiff with grime. But it was all he had. He ducked beneath the awning of a bakery closed for the night, his eyes darting up and down the street. His hands rubbed together for warmth, knuckles red and raw from the cold. His fingers shook, not just from the chill but from the hunger that gnawed at his insides. He hadn't eaten since yesterday's half-eaten sandwich, a mercy tossed his way by a woman with kind eyes but no words. How did it come to this? 2 years ago, Marco Delank had been untouchable. He wore suits that cost more than most people's rent and walked through the world like he owned it. His name was spoken in the same breath as power and influence. People wanted to be him or be next to him. Now people avoided him. No one looked him in the eye. To them, he wasn't Marco Delank anymore. He was a shadow, a man-shaped void in the city's periphery. He leaned against the wall, letting the cold seep into his bones. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the laughter of strangers. It felt like it was coming from a world he no longer belonged to. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled cigarette, but the filter barely intact. Placing it between his lips, he cupped his hands and lit it with a small, flickering lighter. The first drag was sharp, rough, but it was warmth. For a moment, it dulled the ache in his head and the deeper ache in his chest. 2 years. 2 years of this. His eyes fell on the reflection of himself in the rain-slick window of the bakery. Hollow cheeks. Unshaven beard. Eyes sunken, no longer bright with that sharp glint of confidence. He used to be admired for that gaze, commanding, unyielding. Now it was the look of a man who had lost everything. He coughed violently, nearly dropping the cigarette. Bending forward, he braced his hands on his knees, his breath coming out in short, ragged bursts. He squeezed his eyes shut, his mind flashing back to that night. Her face. Her voice. "Elena," he muttered aloud, the sound of her name like a knife against his throat. He remembered it so clearly. The look of pure, unfiltered rage when she'd confronted him. The sharp sting of her slap. The way her eyes had been filled with tears but also something stronger, something colder than he'd ever seen from her. "Get out of my house, out of my life, and out of my future." Her words echoed louder than the rain around him. He hadn't realized it then, but that was the moment everything fell apart. He tried to recover after the wedding was cancelled. He told himself he'd rebuild. People still knew him, right? He was Marco Delank. He had connections, he had charm, he had options. But no one wanted to work with a man who couldn't even manage his personal life. No one wanted to be associated with the man who had cheated on Elena. The whispers spread fast. A man who can't keep his promises won't keep his contracts. His company fell apart within months. Deals he had lined up dissolved without explanation. Investors pulled out. And slowly he found himself spiraling into debt. When the creditors came knocking, he had nothing left to give. His car, his apartment, even his last suit, all taken away. Now here he was, a man with no name, no home, and no future. The cigarette burned down to the filter. He crushed it underfoot. "Spare some change, mate?" he muttered to a passerby, his eyes downcast. The man glanced at him, his nose wrinkling in disgust. He hurried away, pulling his coat tighter around himself. "Yeah, all right. Keep walking," Marco muttered, his eyes burning with quiet humiliation. He leaned back against the wall, eyes closed, letting the cold rain soak him fully. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Time didn't matter anymore. Then he heard footsteps. Delicate, sharp clicks of heeled shoes against wet pavement. His ears perked up. It wasn't the hurried, careless rhythm of someone rushing home. These steps were deliberate, calculated. He glanced up. His breath hitched in his throat. No, it can't be. Her figure was unmistakable. The posture, the confident stride. The sharp, tailored coat. Even through the veil of rain, he recognized her. Her dark hair was tied back neatly, her face half obscured by a scarf, but there was no doubt. Elena. She walked past him, eyes focused straight ahead, unaware of him. Please don't see me. He pulled his hood up, turning his face toward the wall. His heart raced. He could smell the faint trace of her perfume, the one she used to wear when they would walk through town together, arm in arm. Vanilla and jasmine. The memories came back with brutal force. Her laugh. Her warmth. Her love. Keep walking, Elena. Don't look at me. I'm nobody now. But fate had other plans. He heard her footsteps slow. His chest tightened. Marco. Her voice. His name on her lips again. He didn't turn. He couldn't. Marco, she repeated, more certain this time. Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't sad. It was cold. Detached. He squeezed his eyes shut, his breath shallow. Don't look at her. Don't look at her. Look at me, she said, each word like a command. And against his better judgment he did. Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything stopped. The rain, the cold, the world itself, all of it faded. Her eyes didn't soften. There was no pity there. No anger either. She stared at him like she was looking at a cracked mirror, something she used to know, something she once believed in, now broken. Marco? Her voice was quieter this time. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. His lips parted, but before he could utter a word, tires screeched against the wet pavement. Both of them turned. A black van sped toward them, stopping just a few meters away. The doors slid open. Run! Marco shouted, his body jerking into motion too late. 4 masked men poured out. Before Marco could react, they grabbed him. 2 on his arms, 1 on his legs, 1 with an iron grip around his neck. No. Get off me, he yelled, thrashing wildly, his hoarse voice echoing down the street. His eyes locked with Elena's one last time, wild with terror. Elena. Help me. Her feet were frozen in place. She watched, paralyzed, as the men threw him into the van. One of them glanced her way, his eyes hidden behind a mask. For a second he held her gaze. Then the van doors slammed shut. The engine roared. Tires screeched. Her hands shook, nails biting into her palms as she stood there, unmoving. The taillights disappeared into the foggy distance, leaving only the rain. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps. She blinked rapidly, trying to shake herself free. Move, Elena. Call someone. Do something. But she didn't move. Her eyes remained on the spot where Marco had been. Her chest heaved as her mind tried to catch up. Her heart beat too fast, each thud a jarring reminder of the helplessness she hated. She clenched her fists. Her eyes narrowed. Something deeper than fear settled inside her. A quiet, searing determination. They took him. She reached for her phone, already scrolling to the emergency line. But then she stopped. Her thumb hovered. Her eyes shifted toward the road where the van had disappeared. Her heartbeat steadied. Her breath slowed. They took him. But why? And that one question, sharp and clear, stayed with her. What? Elena sat at her desk, fingers drumming a slow, steady rhythm against the wood. Her eyes remained fixed on the blank space ahead, her mind replaying the scene over and over. The black van, the masked men, Marco's wide, desperate eyes as he screamed her name. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of it. She glanced at the screen. Sophia. She hesitated before answering. Hey, Sophia's voice was light, but Elena could hear the subtle concern hidden beneath it. You at the office already? It's barely past 7. Couldn't sleep, Elena muttered, leaning forward, one hand pressed to her temple. Her head ached from overthinking. Something happened. Her silence lingered just a little too long. What kind of something? Sophia asked cautiously. Elena glanced around the empty office as if someone might be listening. She exhaled slowly. I saw Marco. There was a pause on the other end. You're Marco. Sophia's voice was incredulous. The one who wrecked your life 2 years ago? Yeah, Elena said, her voice sharper than she intended. That Marco. Where? Near St. Laurent Avenue, outside that old bakery. He looked. Elena stopped, gripping the edge of her desk. He looked like a ghost. He was homeless, Sophia. Dirty clothes, wild hair, barely even recognized him. I almost didn't stop. Her voice caught on the words and she hated how much they affected her. But you did stop, didn't you? Sophia's tone softened. I did. Elena's voice turned cold. Not that it mattered. Because then a black van pulled up, and 4 men in masks grabbed him right off the street. I saw it happen, Sophia. I saw them take him. A sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. They what? Wait. You're serious? Dead serious. Elena's eyes flicked to the rain-streaked window. I was standing right there, frozen like a fool. I should have done something. Elena, Sophia said firmly, don't do that to yourself. You couldn't have known. Did you call the police? I did, Elena replied, her voice laced with bitterness. Guess what they said? He's a homeless man. Probably wandered off. Like he wasn't worth the effort. Of course they did, Sophia muttered angrily. The police don't lift a finger unless it's a headline case or someone with money is involved. Exactly, Elena said, her eyes narrowing. That's why I'm going to handle it myself. No, Sophia's voice was firm, louder this time. No, you don't get to do that. You're not some vigilante, Elena. This isn't a movie. You can't just go chasing after vans on your own. I'm not chasing vans, Elena snapped, her fingers tapping her phone screen. I'm chasing evidence. Don't do this alone, Sophia pleaded. I'm serious, Elena. Then help me, Elena said, her tone soft but firm. Help me, Sophia. Silence. Fine, Sophia finally muttered. But if I end up in a jail cell next to you, I'm blaming you for all of it. By midday, Elena stood outside a small pharmacy near where the abduction happened. She approached the counter where a bored-looking teenage clerk stood, tapping on his phone. He barely glanced at her. Can I help you? He said, still scrolling. Yes, you can. Elena pulled out her ID and flashed it with a practiced flick of her hand. I'm a lawyer and I need access to your surveillance footage from last night. The clerk blinked, finally looking up. I don't think I can. You can, Elena said, her eyes locked onto his like a predator. And you will. Or I'll make a call to your manager, and we'll have a whole conversation about obstruction of justice. Sound good? His eyes darted nervously toward the back of the store. Without a word, he motioned for her to follow him. In the back room, screens displayed grainy footage from multiple angles. The clerk sat down at the computer, fingers clumsy on the keyboard. Time frame? He asked. Between 9:30 and 10 o'clock last night, Elena said. She watched as the footage rewound, street scenes flashing by in reverse. Then there it was, the van. Stop, she ordered. The clerk froze the footage. She leaned in, eyes narrowing as she spotted the van pulling up to the curb. The timestamp read 9:47 p.m. There, she muttered. Play it. The video rolled forward in real time. The van stopped. 4 men stepped out. Marco's figure was barely in frame, leaning against the wall. Then like a nightmare they grabbed him. Fast, precise, calculated. Elena's heart pounded harder with every second. She watched as the men threw Marco inside. One of them glanced toward the pharmacy's camera. His face was covered, but his eyes were sharp. Calculating. The clerk muttered a curse under his breath. That's messed up. Rewind, Elena said, eyes locked on the screen. Freeze it on the license plate. The image blurred, then cleared. There it was, BRH 8241. Elena pulled out her phone, taking a quick photo of the screen. Her mind was already calculating her next move. Back at the office, Sophia hovered near Elena's desk, chewing on a pen cap. You're really doing this, huh? Elena didn't respond, her fingers flying over her laptop's keyboard. She was logged into a database for legal professionals, searching for information linked to the van's registration. Plate number, Sophia said, leaning forward. If it's registered, you'll get an address. Already working on it, Elena muttered, cross-referencing it with known shell companies and fleet registrations. She scrolled through a list of names, her eyes moving with precision. Then she stopped. No. Her stomach dropped. There it was. The van was registered under a shell company called Northmont Holdings Limited. Elena clicked on it. Her eyes widened. Owner of record, Weiss Legal Consulting. Her blood went cold. Gregor Weiss, she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. No, it can't be him. Sophia leaned in. Wait, Gregor Weiss? You're Gregor Weiss. Yes, Elena said, leaning back, fingers pressed to her lips. My old mentor. He runs Weiss Legal Consulting. Her mind raced with possibilities. It made no sense. Gregor Weiss was a man of pristine reputation. He taught her everything about precision and integrity. He wasn't involved in this. Are you sure it's him? Sophia asked, concern growing in her voice. Positive, Elena said, clenching her jaw. I know how Gregor sets up his shell companies. He taught me himself. Sophia's face twisted with unease. This is getting too big, Elena. If Gregor's involved, you're not just poking at a beehive. You're poking at the hive queen. I know, Elena muttered. But I'm not stopping now. Sophia leaned closer, whispering like they were being watched. If Gregor knows you're onto him, he won't just sit back and wait, Elena. He'll strike first. I know, Elena repeated, her eyes hard as steel. Her phone buzzed. A new message. She glanced at the screen. Gregor Weiss, we need to talk. Call me. Her eyes lingered on the message, thumb hovering over the screen. She could call him. She could play it safe. Or she could keep following the thread. Elena locked the phone. She looked at Sophia. Dig deeper, she said, eyes cold with resolve. Every company he's touched, every name he's ever mentioned in court, every deal he's made. I want it all. Sophia nodded, her gaze sharp. Got it? Elena leaned back, eyes on the ceiling, heart steady but her mind sharper than ever. They had taken Marco. They had taken him right in front of her. And now Gregor Weiss's name was on the paper trail. Your move, Gregor. Elena adjusted the collar of her coat as she stood in front of the towering Weiss Legal Consulting building. Its mirrored glass walls reflected the world around it, giving nothing away, just like its owner. She stared at her own reflection, her eyes hard and unyielding. For a moment, she imagined her former self, the wide-eyed, eager protégé desperate for Gregor's approval. That girl was gone. With one final breath, she walked inside. The receptionist at the front desk glanced up, her eyes widening in surprise. Miss Delank? Is Gregor in? Elena's tone left no room for debate. He's in a meeting right now, but I'm not waiting. Elena strode past the desk, heels clacking against the polished floor. Her heart pounded, but her face was calm as stone. Her body moved with purpose, her mind a storm of questions, doubts, and certainty all clashing at once. By the time she reached Gregor's office, his assistant, Daniel, was already standing in her path. He raised his hands, flashing her an awkward smile. Elena, you know how this works. No unannounced visits. I'm not here for small talk, Daniel, she snapped, eyes locking with his. Move. Elena, seriously? Move. Her voice cut through him like ice. She didn't have time for games. Daniel hesitated, glanced toward the closed office door and stepped aside. Elena opened the door without knocking. Inside, Gregor Weiss sat behind a large oak desk, his sleeves rolled up, a fountain pen in hand, mid-signature on a legal document. He didn't look up right away. His cool, methodical nature was the first lesson he'd ever taught her. Control the room by controlling your attention. When he finally raised his eyes, his surprise was brief but noticeable. Elena, he said smoothly, setting his pen down with precision. To what do I owe this unexpected visit? She shut the door behind her, locking it with a soft click. Let's not play games, Gregor. She stepped forward, hands in her coat pockets, her eyes steady on him like a predator watching prey. I'm not here for pleasantries. I have questions and I want real answers. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled together, that familiar calculated grin forming on his face. Questions, And here I thought you left my firm to escape my overbearing influence. Funny, she replied dryly, taking a seat across from him. Because it seems like your influence extends further than I thought. Like, let's say the owner of a shell company called Northmont Holdings Limited. For the first time, Gregor's grin faltered. Not by much, but enough for her to see it. Got you. I'm not sure what you're talking about, he said, leaning forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. Why don't you be a little more specific, Elena? Sure, she said, pulling out her phone. She swiped to the photo she'd taken of the van's license plate tied to Northmont Holdings. She turned the screen toward him, her eyes never leaving his face. This van. For masked men. They abducted someone off St. Laurent Avenue last night. The van is registered to Northmont Holdings. A company you own. Gregor's eyes flicked to the screen, then back to her face. He leaned back, expression unreadable, his fingers tapping once on the armrest. One tap. He's thinking. Elena, you're chasing ghosts, he said after a pause. I handle legal filings for dozens of companies. Shells, trust funds, holding groups. Northmont is just one of many. If you're trying to tie me to some abduction story, you're going to be disappointed. Disappointed? She let out a short, sharp laugh. The only person who's going to be disappointed is you, Gregor. Disappointed when I drag you into court with receipts. Gregor's grin returned, wider this time, like she'd said something amusing. And what receipts would those be, exactly? Elena leaned forward, her face inches from his now. Her voice was a low, dangerous whisper. The kind that ends careers. The kind that turns influential legal consultant into disgraced criminal in one press release. Her eyes burned with intensity, sharper than any blade. But if you think I'm bluffing, Gregor, I dare you to call it. Silence filled the room, tense and heavy. For a moment, neither of them moved. Gregor raised his hands slowly, palms open, his smile thinner now. Elena, I always admired your fire. But don't mistake the furnace for the flame. One can burn for years. The other? Burns out in seconds. Her jaw clenched. Her heart was telling her to fight, but her mind knew this wasn't the moment to push too far. Keep the riddles, Gregor, she said, standing up. I'll be back. And next time I won't be alone. That night, as rain lashed against her apartment window, Elena poured herself a glass of wine. She sat in the glow of her desk lamp, flipping through case files, notes and surveillance footage on her laptop. Her mind replayed every word Gregor had said. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. A name she hadn't seen in a long time. Isabel. Her chest tightened. Not now. But then the second message appeared. Isabel, please, Elena. I need to talk to you. It's about Gregor. Elena sat up straight, wine forgotten. Her heart beat faster. No, not her. Not again. Another message came in. Isabel, I know you hate me, but I swear I'm telling the truth. I saw him with those men. The ones who took Marco. I know where they're meeting next. Elena's hand hovered over the phone. She didn't trust Isabel. She hadn't trusted her for 2 years, and with good reason. Her cousin had betrayed her in every possible way. But that message, it was too specific to ignore. After 5 minutes of internal battle, she called. Hello. Isabel's voice was nervous, shaky. You have 30 seconds, Elena said, her tone as sharp as broken glass. I know where Gregor is meeting those men. There's a place on Rue Duval, Isabel said quickly. He met with them 3 nights ago. I saw it happen. Elena's breath caught. Rue Duval. Near the warehouse where Marco had been taken. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Her voice was ice, distrust evident in every word. Is this another game, Isabel? No, Elena, it's not. Isabel's voice cracked, emotion creeping in. I know I ruined everything. I know. But I'm trying to make it right. I need to make it right. Elena pressed her lips into a thin line, heart thudding in her chest. Her instincts told her not to trust Isabel. But something in her cousin's voice, it wasn't the smug, self-assured tone she used to hear. This was different. Meet me tomorrow, Elena said finally. 8 a.m. Don't be late. Okay, Isabel said, her relief palpable. Elena hung up, staring at the phone in her hand. Her fingers tightened around it like she could crush it. You lied to me again, she whispered to herself, and I'll bury you myself. Her gaze shifted to her laptop, where Gregor Weiss's name was still highlighted in her search. 2 snakes, she muttered. But I'll cut off both their heads. The grand ballroom of the Belmore estate shimmered like a world untethered from reality. Chandeliers glittered like falling stars, their crystal teardrops reflecting the golden glow of the warm, ambient lighting. Soft classical music echoed through the marble-floored hall, mingling with the low hum of laughter and conversation from men in tailored suits and women in gowns that could have been mistaken for museum pieces. Elena stood at the edge of it all, champagne flute in hand, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd like a wolf circling a herd. Her gown was midnight blue, sleek and elegant, with a slit running up the side. She'd let her hair down for the first time in months, soft waves cascading over one shoulder. To anyone else, she looked like just another guest, graceful, poised, and utterly untouchable. But her mind was a battlefield. To her right, Sophia hovered near the bar, feigning interest in the cocktail menu. Her emerald green dress hugged her frame, and her earrings caught the light with every subtle turn of her head. She wasn't looking at the bartender, though. Her eyes darted toward the far corner of the room where Gregor Weiss stood, smiling and laughing with his associates. He was as polished as ever, crisp gray suit, silver cufflinks that shone like daggers, and that same controlled smirk he always wore in the courtroom. Target in sight, Sophia muttered through the small comms device tucked discreetly into her earring. Keep him in your line of sight, Elena replied, her lips barely moving as she took a slow sip of her champagne. Her gaze lingered on Gregor for a moment longer before shifting. "Don't engage. Not yet." Across the room, Isabel made her entrance, eyes scanning the crowd like she was born to be there. Her deep red gown shimmered with every step, catching the eyes of several men as she passed. She smiled at them coyly but didn't slow down. Isabel had always known how to draw attention, but this time she wasn't doing it for herself. "Elena," Isabel's voice came through the comm, "I'm in." Headed toward the VIP section. "Good," Elena replied, watching her cousin weave through the crowd with effortless grace. "Stick to the plan. We're not here to make a scene. Not yet, anyway." An hour passed. The three women moved like shadows through the crowd, weaving between clusters of guests. Conversations floated around them like fog, whispered deals, empty flattery, and the occasional underhanded joke about lesser people beyond the gates of wealth. Elena had heard it all before. It used to make her angry. Now it only made her sharper. "Status update," Sophia's voice crackled softly through the comm. "Gregor's still near the Northeast Lounge," Isabel reported. Her voice had an edge of tension, but she kept her tone steady. "He's been talking to 3 men. One of them matches the description you sent me. Tall, bald, with a scar above his right eyebrow." Elena's heart rate ticked up. "One of the men from the surveillance footage." "Good. Keep eyes on him," Elena said. She turned toward Sophia. "Any word on Marco?" "Nothing yet," Sophia replied, frustration bleeding into her voice. "If he's here, he's deep in the shadows." Elena's jaw clenched. "He's here. I know he is." Her eyes flickered to Gregor, watching him as he leaned in to whisper something to one of the bald man's companions. The man's eyes darted toward the far end of the ballroom, a hallway guarded by 2 men in black suits. "North hallway," Elena said softly. "See it?" "Yep," Sophia replied, already moving. 2 guards. "Something's behind that door." "Could be Marco," Isabel added. "Or something worse." Elena adjusted her clutch, hiding the small burner phone inside. Her fingers curled around it as she started to walk, casually weaving through the crowd toward the hallway. She kept her posture relaxed, her gaze distant, like she was looking for the restroom. The guards glanced at her but didn't react. "Good. Keep it that way." Moments later, she met up with Sophia in a quiet corner just out of view. Isabel lingered on the opposite side of the room, still playing her part as the guest of the night. "How do you want to play this?" Sophia asked, glancing toward the hallway. "We try to sneak past them and it's over if they catch us." Elena didn't respond immediately. Her eyes darted toward Gregor. He was laughing now, hands clasped behind his back as he strolled toward the same hallway. Her mind moved fast, calculating, shifting. "Change of plans," Elena muttered. "We're going to force him to play his hand." "Meaning?" Sophia's brow lifted. Elena's gaze locked onto Gregor. "We make him show his teeth." 15 minutes later, all hell broke loose. Elena had timed it perfectly. Isabel accidentally bumped into one of the waiters, causing an explosion of red wine across a table of wealthy guests. Cries of shock and outrage filled the air as guests leapt from their seats, dabbing at their clothes with napkins. The guards by the hallway shifted, glancing toward the disturbance. That was all the time Elena needed. She was already moving. Sophia followed close behind. They ducked into the hallway, their steps silent but swift. 2 guards. No time for subtlety. "Hey!" one of the guards barked, stepping forward. Elena didn't hesitate. Her elbow shot up, slamming into the man's throat. He stumbled back, gasping for air. Sophia pivoted, grabbing the second guard's wrist, twisting it until he dropped his radio. She kneed him hard in the stomach and he went down. Elena pulled out her phone. She pressed a series of keys with one hand while scanning the hallway. Her fingers moved like lightning. The phone vibrated once. Message sent. "You called the police?" Sophia asked, wiping her hands on her dress. "I gave them a reason to care," Elena replied, slipping the phone back into her clutch. "Anonymous tip about human trafficking. Let them figure it out." "Smart," Sophia muttered, glancing behind them. "They'll be here fast." "Faster than Gregor can cover his tracks," Elena said, eyes fierce. They moved deeper into the hallway. At the end, they found a locked metal door. Elena glanced at Sophia, who nodded, pulling a hairpin from her bun. In seconds, Sophia had the lock picked. The door creaked open. The room beyond was dimly lit, but they could see it. Crates, labeled, numbered, each one the size of a shipping container. Elena's eyes scanned the markings. Human cargo. Her heart stopped. No, she whispered, stepping inside. Her hands brushed the nearest crate. It was cold. Her fingers trembled. Not people. Tell me it's not people. Sophia crouched by the crate, her face pale. It's them, isn't it? Elena opened her mouth to answer, but the sound of footsteps behind them made her freeze. They turned to see Gregor standing in the doorway, flanked by 3 guards. His face was no longer smiling. No charm. No grace. Just cold, ruthless control. You should have stayed away, Elena, he said, his voice like gravel. Yeah, well, she replied, standing tall. I never was very good at obedience. Gregor's eyes narrowed. Take them. The guards rushed forward. Elena and Sophia raised their fists, ready to fight. The first punch hit her ribs like a hammer. She gasped but didn't fall. She twisted, throwing her elbow into a guard's temple, but the second one grabbed her arms. No, not like this. Get off me. Sophia yelled, fighting against 2 guards at once. Gregor stepped forward slowly, his eyes like ice. Call it off, Gregor, Elena snarled, breathless but defiant. He leaned in close, his breath cold against her ear. Game over, Elena. Not yet. Distant sirens echoed in the night air. Elena smiled. Game's just getting started. The cold metal clanged like thunder as the cell door slammed shut behind Elena. She didn't flinch. She stood still, eyes forward, hands at her sides, her breath slow and steady. Her heart should have been racing, but it wasn't. She'd prepared herself for this. The guard glanced at her over his shoulder. Make yourself comfortable, Delank, he said with a smirk. You'll be here for a while. Not as long as you think, she thought, her eyes narrowing as she stared at his back. She didn't waste energy replying. He wanted to see her break. Everyone did. They won't. The cell was small, concrete walls stained with time, a narrow metal bed bolted to the floor, and a thin mattress that looked like it had seen better days. A small, foggy window let in a sliver of pale daylight. The air was damp and stale, thick with the smell of bleach and rust. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes scanning every corner, every crack, every potential entry point for sound, light, or surveillance. If you know the room, you control the room. Another lesson from Gregor. She hated that his voice echoed in her mind. Her fingers pressed against the mattress, feeling its rough surface. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, and breathed in slowly. She wasn't scared. She was angry. And anger was sharper than fear. 2 days later, the news broke. Disgraced lawyer Elena Delank arrested for obstruction of justice. Her face was plastered across every news channel, her mugshot framed next to the headline in stark, bold letters. The media frenzy was exactly what Gregor had wanted. Her name was poisoned now. Her reputation ruined. From her cell, she could hear the guards talking as they walked by. She used to be the untouchable lawyer, huh? Look at her now. Yeah, all that righteousness didn't do her much good, did it? Elena stared at the wall, jaw clenched. She focused on her breathing. You can break my name. You can break my image, but you will never break me. Sophia arrived on the 3rd day. The visit was brief, the window between them a thick layer of scratched plexiglass. The phone on Elena's side crackled as she lifted it to her ear. You look like hell, Sophia said, eyes scanning her face. Thanks, Elena replied dryly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her sharp features were harder now, more defined. Her cheekbones cut shadows across her face, and the glow of the fluorescent lights above her made her look colder than she felt. Sophia leaned forward. I've been digging. Her voice was low, her eyes darting to the side as if watching for anyone listening. It's bad, Elena. Gregor's got the police, the courts, even the media playing his game. He's paying off everyone. I know, Elena said, her voice steady. He's not just tying up loose ends. He's sending a message. Yeah, well, message received, Sophia muttered, glancing back at the door behind her. But we're not done. Adrian's on it. That name pulled a small, almost imperceptible smile from Elena. Adrian? Yeah. He reached out after he saw the news, Sophia said, leaning closer. He's got files, Elena. Bank transfers. Flight logs. Offshore accounts linked to Gregor. And guess what? She raised an eyebrow. He's found a connection to that warehouse where Marco was taken. Elena's eyes flickered with a new light, cold, sharp, hungry. Then we keep pushing, Elena said, gripping the phone tighter. Get me everything. Every name. Every signature. I want it all. Already on it, Sophia said. You just stay strong in here. They want you to feel isolated, like you're cut off. She leaned forward, her face so close it nearly pressed against the glass. But you're not alone. Elena's throat tightened, but she nodded once, her eyes locked on Sophia's. I know. Before the guards could come to drag her away, Sophia tapped the glass twice with her knuckles, then walked off with her head high. On the 6th day she received a letter. It was slipped through the slot at the bottom of her cell door. No markings. No return address. Just a name. Adrian Moreau. She unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the neatly typed message. Elena. I know you think you're alone, but you're not. I have proof linking Gregor to the trafficking network. Enclosed are the names of the shell companies he's using to launder the money. One of them is connected to the warehouse where Marco was taken. We're going to burn it all down. Keep your head up. Adrian. Her fingers tightened on the letter. She reread it twice, her heart beating harder with each pass. Proof. Finally, proof. Her eyes scanned the names at the bottom of the page. Northmont Holdings Ltd. Velocer Trust. Greywater Imports. All of them familiar. Too familiar. She recognized them from cases she'd worked on under Gregor's guidance. Her breath slowed, her eyes narrowing. You arrogant fool, she whispered to herself. You didn't even hide it. On the 10th day, Isabel visited. The moment Elena saw her face, her blood boiled. Don't even start, Isabel said as she sat down, eyes pleading. Her red hair was tied back in a simple bun, and she wore a plain gray coat, not her usual designer flair. I'm not here to beg for forgiveness. I'm here to help. Help? Elena raised an eyebrow, her expression sharp and skeptical. Last time you helped, you burned my entire life to the ground. I know, Isabel said, her voice raw. And I've been paying for it every day since. She pressed her hands to the glass. But listen to me, Elena. Gregor isn't untouchable. You were right about the men at the warehouse. They're still moving people in and out, and I saw Marco. Elena's heart stopped. You're sure? Positive, Isabel said firmly. He's alive, Elena. Her breath caught in her throat, her hands tightening into fists. She glanced at the guards pacing behind Isabel. I'm getting out, Elena said quietly, her voice low but filled with steel. And when I do, we're going to burn them all to ash. Isabel nodded, her eyes filled with something Elena had never seen before. Conviction. Then let me help, Isabel said, leaning forward. You don't have to trust me, but you need me. I know how they move, I know their routines. I can get you inside. Elena's eyes didn't leave Isabel's face. Every instinct told her to walk away. But something about her cousin's voice felt different this time. All right, she said after a long pause. But if you betray me again, her eyes turned hard as stone, I will bury you myself. Isabel didn't flinch. Fair. 2 days later, Adrian's investigation bore fruit. Elena was called into a meeting room with her lawyer, Sophia, grinning ear to ear. We've got it, Sophia said, eyes blazing with victory. Transfer records, contracts, wire logs, all signed by Gregor. Elena breathed slowly, her gaze fierce. They can't ignore it. They won't, Sophia replied. I filed the petition this morning. You'll be out by tomorrow? Elena leaned back, her eyes sharp, her mind focused. Gregor, you should have buried me deeper. The next morning, as the guards escorted her out of the cell, she glanced back one last time. You thought I was a lion in a cage, Gregor. Her lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. But you forgot one thing. Lions are only caged until the door opens. The air outside the detention center tasted like freedom. Elena inhaled deeply, eyes closed, feeling the crisp autumn wind rush over her skin. For a moment, she stood still, letting it wash away the cold, suffocating weight of the past few weeks in that cell. Welcome back to the real world, Sophia said, standing next to her with a grin that could cut steel. Her arms were folded, coat pulled tightly around her to ward off the chill. Miss me? Elena cracked a smile, small but genuine. Not as much as I missed breathing air that didn't smell like bleach and regret. They both laughed, the kind of laugh you have after surviving something you weren't sure you'd make it out of. Sophia glanced at the black SUV parked at the curb. Adrian's waiting in the car, Sophia said, tilting her head toward the vehicle. He's got everything. Wire transfers, encrypted files, names, dates, and Gregor's fingerprints are all over it. Elena nodded, her face hardening with focus. Good. No more half measures. We bring it all down. By the time they reached Sophia's apartment, Adrian was already unpacking his laptop. The familiar hum of its startup echoed through the small, warmly lit room. The walls were lined with bookshelves stuffed with legal manuals, case files, and more than a few well-worn mystery novels. Adrian looked up from his screen, his face lit by the glow. Elena, he said with a grin, arms open. "Welcome back from the underworld." "Nice to be back," she replied, walking over and giving him a quick hug. "Please tell me you've got something good." "Oh, I've got something better than good," Adrian said, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "This?" He spun the laptop around to face her. On the screen was a folder labeled Project Perseus. Elena raised an eyebrow. "What am I looking at?" "Gregor's entire operation," Adrian replied, tapping the screen. "Bank transfers from accounts linked to Northmont Holdings. Payments to offshore accounts connected to cargo shipping companies. Export licenses for textiles that match the shipping manifest from the same warehouse Marco was taken to." Elena's eyes flickered as she connected the dots. "They're moving people under the guise of shipping products." "Bingo," Adrian said, clicking to open one of the files. A series of routes appeared on the screen, red lines crisscrossing from port to port, country to country. "This is it, Elena. These are the trafficking routes. This is the proof." Sophia leaned in, her eyes scanning the screen. "It's enough to get a warrant." "It's more than enough," Elena said, her gaze narrowing. "We don't just want a warrant. We want public outrage." Her mind moved quickly, pieces clicking into place. "We leak it to the media," she said firmly. "Not just one source, all of them. Gregor's reputation will burn before he even sees the search warrant hit his desk." Sophia grinned, nodding. "I like the way you think, boss." Adrian tilted his head. "You sure about that? Once it's out there, Gregor will know we're coming for him. He's going to burn evidence, call in favors, disappear people." "Let him," Elena replied, eyes sharp as glass. "He can burn all the paper he wants. But people like Gregor always keep one thing they can't burn." She leaned forward, voice low and firm. "Their pride. He'll fight to prove he's still in control. And that's when we take him." 2 days later. The press conference was packed. Journalists, photographers, and TV crews jostled for space as flashbulbs popped like fireworks. The world had been waiting for her to speak, and now Elena Delanque was about to give them what they craved. She stepped up to the podium, every eye in the room on her. Her midnight blue blazer and white blouse were as sharp as her words were about to be. The cameras zoomed in close as she took a deep breath, then began. "My name is Elena Delanque," she said, her voice steady, controlled. "And I have been silent for too long." The room went still. Not a whisper. Not a shuffle. Total focus. 2 weeks ago, I was arrested under false charges of obstruction of justice," she continued. Her eyes scanned the crowd like she was picking each person out individually. "But the truth is, I wasn't obstructing justice. I was pursuing it." Her words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. She raised a folder in her hand, labeled Project Perseus. The cameras zoomed in. Inside this folder are financial records, encrypted communications, shipping manifests, and direct evidence linking Gregor Weiss and his associates to an international human trafficking network, she declared, her voice louder, sharper now. "They thought I would stay quiet. They thought I would break. But here I stand, unbroken." The crowd erupted in a frenzy of flashes and voices calling her name. "I am calling on the justice system, the media, and the public to do what must be done," she said, her eyes fierce with conviction. "No more shadows. No more hidden deals. No more untouchables." Her gaze hardened. "The web of corruption ends here. Today." The room exploded with questions, flashes, and reporters calling out for comment. Elena raised a hand, silencing them. "The authorities have everything they need to act. And I promise you they will." She stepped back from the podium, letting the weight of her words sink into the world beyond. That night, back at Sophia's apartment, the mood was electric. News stations replayed her press conference on loop, talking heads dissecting every word. Elena watched quietly, eyes sharp and thoughtful. "You did it," Sophia said, sitting next to her on the couch, a glass of wine in hand. "You turned the world against him." "Not yet," Elena replied, her gaze focused on the TV. "He's still free." Her phone buzzed. A message from Adrian. "Adrian, check your email. We cracked his laptop. You're gonna want to see this." Elena's eyes widened. She grabbed her laptop, fingers moving quickly as she opened her inbox. There it was, an email from Adrian with the subject line, "Found it." She clicked it. Attached was a file labeled Personal Ledger. Her heart stopped as she opened it. Names, payments, locations, people. Gregor hadn't just been running the operation. He was the architect. He didn't just track them, Elena muttered, her eyes scanning the names of victims. He sold them. Her breath was slow, controlled, but every muscle in her body felt like it was on fire. She flipped to the final page. Her eyes stopped on one name. Marco Delank. Her jaw clenched. Her fingers hovered over the name as her chest tightened with quiet, seething rage. "He's alive," she whispered. "What?" Sophia glanced over, leaning forward. "Marco," Elena said louder, her eyes still locked on the screen. "They didn't kill him. They sold him." Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest. She sat up straight, eyes full of cold resolve. "Call Adrian," Elena said firmly, closing the laptop. "We need that warrant. Tonight." Sophia didn't argue. She grabbed her phone, her fingers already dialing. Elena leaned forward, her hands clasped together, eyes dark with fury. "Gregor Weiss, you should have killed me when you had the chance." Her phone buzzed again. This time, a message from an unknown number. "Unknown, I know you're coming, Elena. Let's see if you're as brave as you pretend to be." Her eyes narrowed. Her reply was immediate. "Elena, watch me." The city woke up to the sound of sirens. Not the usual wail of ambulances or patrol cars, but something louder, more urgent. Police convoys snaked through the streets of the financial district, tires screeching as tactical units pulled up in front of the Weiss Legal Consulting building. The air hummed with tension. News vans swarmed the scene like vultures, cameras rolling, microphones aimed at the growing line of police officers in tactical gear. Crowds gathered behind barricades, murmuring to each other as if they'd stumbled upon a scene from a crime thriller. Inside his office, Gregor Weiss stood by the window, hands in his pockets, his eyes narrowed as he watched the police line up outside. His calm exterior remained intact, but his jaw tightened with every passing second. "They're here," he muttered, turning toward his assistant, Daniel, who stood frozen near the doorway, face pale with panic. What do we do?" Daniel stammered, his eyes darting toward the exit like a caged animal. Gregor walked slowly to his desk, fingers tracing its smooth oak surface. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. No answer. No answer. No answer. His allies, his connections, his leverage, gone. "They're not coming," he muttered to himself, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Sir?" Daniel's voice trembled. "They've abandoned me," Gregor said, his voice hardening as he pocketed his phone. He turned to Daniel, eyes colder than they'd ever been. "You should leave, Daniel." But what about you?" Daniel asked, his breath shallow. Gregor's eyes fixed on him, and for a moment, Daniel saw it. The man he'd followed all these years, not as a mentor, but as something far more dangerous. "I stay," Gregor said, his smile thin, sharp like broken glass. "A king does not run from his throne." Breaking news: police raid legal powerhouse, Gregor Weiss arrested. Live footage flooded every news network. Reporters spoke in urgent tones, their voices breathless as they narrated the scene. Elena sat at Sophia's apartment, eyes fixed on the television. Her hand hovered over a mug of coffee, but she hadn't touched it. Her gaze never wavered from the screen. "Here it comes," Sophia muttered beside her, leaning forward, elbows on her knees. "They've got him." The screen shifted to a live feed. Cameras zoomed in as Gregor Weiss was led out of his office in handcuffs, his wrists bound behind his back. His tailored suit was still immaculate, but his face was grim. No smile. No arrogance. Only silence. Flashes erupted from the sea of photographers as Gregor descended the front steps, flanked by 2 officers. The crowd erupted into a frenzy of shouts and questions. "Gregor, any comment on the charges against you? Do you deny the accusations, Mr. Weiss? Is it true you were running a trafficking ring?" Gregor's eyes didn't shift. He stared forward, his jaw set, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't give them the satisfaction of a glance. Elena leaned forward, her fingers digging into her knees as she watched him. "Look at me, Gregor. Just once." "You didn't?" She exhaled slowly, leaning back. "He's not going to break in front of them." "Doesn't have to," Sophia replied, her eyes never leaving the screen. "He'll break in the courtroom." 2 weeks later, the courtroom. The courtroom was packed with reporters, cameras lined up behind the glass partition. Gregor Weiss sat at the defense table, his once pristine image now battered. No tailored suit today, he wore a plain, dark gray prison uniform. His eyes were sharp, darting toward the prosecution table. Sitting there, calm as ever, was Elena Delank. Her gaze met his. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink, the noise of the room fading into static. 2 predators, 2 former allies, now standing on opposite sides of the same battlefield. Elena tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into a slow, deliberate smile. She could see it, the flicker of recognition, the hint of fear. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the judge entered the room, robes flowing behind him like the curtain call of a grand performance. Elena remained still, her eyes never leaving Gregor. The People versus Gregor Weiss. Her name echoed through the courtroom as the lead prosecutor stood to deliver the opening statement. The charges were read aloud, each one like a hammer striking an anvil. Human trafficking, money laundering, conspiracy, organized crime. Gregor sat motionless, his eyes locked forward. But Elena could see it now, the twitch of his fingers, the subtle shift of his jaw. He knows he's finished. The footage was grainy, but the message was clear. Police body cams captured every second of the raid on the warehouse. Officers breached the doors, storming in with weapons raised. The camera shook as shouts echoed, men yelling, "Down! Hands where I can see them," while suspects dropped to their knees. And then, in the far corner of the footage, a figure appeared. Thin, ragged. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. "Marco. Over here," one of the officers called. 2 officers rushed forward, helping Marco to his feet. He blinked slowly, his eyes disoriented, lips dry and cracked. He mumbled something, but the words were lost in the static. Elena watched the footage from her office, her eyes wide. "He's alive. He's alive." Sophia's voice came from behind her. "He looks rough, but he's breathing." Elena leaned forward, eyes locked on the screen. "That's enough." The media storm was relentless. But amid the chaos, one headline stood out. Isabel Delanque testifies against Gregor Weiss in court. Elena watched from her seat in the courtroom as Isabel took the stand. Her cousin's hands shook as she raised them for the oath, but her voice was steady as she spoke. "Gregor Weiss recruited me," Isabel said, her eyes focused on the jury. "He used me to make introductions. He knew I had access to social circles that would never suspect me. I thought it was just parties, events, but it was more than that." Her voice cracked. "It was so much worse." Elena watched, her jaw tight but her eyes unwavering. "Keep going, Isabel. Finish what you started." Isabel wiped a tear from her cheek, inhaling deeply. "I'm here because I made mistakes. I helped him. But I'm not going to let him walk free. Not after everything he's done." The courtroom murmured, the weight of her words sinking in. On the charge of human trafficking, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy, guilty. On the charge of organized crime, guilty. One by one the charges were read. Each guilty felt like a stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples reaching everyone in the room. Gregor sat motionless, his eyes dark, empty. His fingers were still now. No tapping. No control. Elena didn't smile this time. She watched him quietly, her face like stone. She didn't need to smile. The sound of the gavel was all she needed. "The defendant is hereby sentenced to 45 years in federal prison." The courtroom erupted into murmurs and flashes from the cameras. Elena sat still, her fingers laced together, watching as Gregor was escorted out in cuffs. He glanced back at her once, his eyes filled with something unfamiliar. Regret. Too late, she thought. Later that night, Elena sat alone in her apartment. The television played softly in the background, but she wasn't watching. She stared at the view from her window, the glow of the city lights stretching far into the distance. Her phone buzzed. A message from Adrian. "Adrian, you did it?" Her eyes lingered on the message for a moment. Her fingers hovered over the screen. "Elena, we did it." Her eyes drifted to the window once more. Somewhere out there, people were free because of her. She leaned back, eyes closing for just a moment, her chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. "You called me a lion in a cage, Gregor." Her lips curled into a faint smile. "But now I'm free. And you? You'll never see the sun again." The sun filtered through the tall windows of Elena's new office, casting golden streaks of light across the polished oak floor. The space was larger than any office she'd ever had, with high ceilings and a panoramic view of the city skyline. The noise of car horns and distant chatter from the street below felt muted from up here, as if she were somehow above it all. Her desk was sleek, minimalist. No clutter. Just a single framed photo of her parents and a small bronze statue of Lady Justice, blindfolded, sword raised high. Elena stood by the window, hands in her pockets, her gaze fixed on the city she'd fought to protect. But her thoughts were far from serene. What now? She wondered. When the storm is over, what do you do with the quiet? Her phone buzzed on the desk, cutting through her thoughts. It was Sophia. "Boss?" Sophia's voice came through the speaker. "CNN just ran another piece on you. They're calling you the Lion of Justice." Sounds pretty cool, huh? Elena exhaled sharply through her nose. Yeah, real catchy. Don't be like that, Sophia teased. You earned it, Elena. People are finally seeing it. They're finally seeing you. Yeah, Elena said, walking back to her desk. She sat in the chair, fingers drumming on the armrest. But fame isn't justice, Sophia. Recognition isn't reform. True, Sophia agreed. But it's a start. Take the win, boss. Elena tilted her head back, closing her eyes for a brief moment. Anything else? Yeah, Sophia said with a grin in her voice. 3 more law firms just called. They want to know if you're taking offers. Not interested. Thought you'd say that. Elena hung up, tossing the phone aside. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. For so long she'd been in survival mode, moving, fighting, clawing for every inch of ground. And now that she'd won, the stillness was unsettling. Don't get comfortable, she told herself. You know better than that. Elena stood in the conference room, arms crossed as she listened to Adrian lay out his proposal. A large whiteboard behind him was filled with notes, bullet points, and arrows connecting the names of shell companies and trafficking routes. Here's the pitch, Adrian said, tapping the whiteboard with his marker. You step into the spotlight as the public advocate for trafficking survivors. You'd have the public's trust, the media's attention, and every platform you could want. Interviews, panels, partnerships with nonprofits, all of it. Elena frowned. You're talking about being a mascot. No, Adrian replied firmly, turning to face her. I'm talking about being a symbol. People are already looking at you like you're untouchable, Elena. You could leverage that to get more done than any lawyer in a courtroom. Leverage? She repeated, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, he said, leaning forward on the table, eyes locked on hers. Right now you're a lion in a cage, pacing, looking for a fight. But what if, instead of waiting for fights, you built a battlefield? Silence hung between them. Sophia sat nearby, arms folded, watching Elena's face closely. Elena's eyes moved to the whiteboard. The names of victims, dates, locations, shipping routes, all of it still fresh in her mind. Her fingers tapped her arm as she considered it. Advocacy is visibility, Adrian said, his voice lower, more persuasive now. And visibility is power. She stared at him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. Fine, she said. But no panels. No fluff pieces. Adrian grinned, tapping his pen on the table. Deal. That evening, Elena stepped out of the elevator and into the quiet hall of her apartment building. Her heels clicked softly against the floor as she walked toward her door. But just as she reached it, she noticed someone sitting on the ground, leaning against the wall. Isabel. Her red hair was tied back in a loose bun, and her coat was pulled tightly around her, like she was bracing for the cold. She looked up as Elena approached, her eyes cautious but not fearful. Elena stopped, eyes narrowing. What are you doing here, Isabel? I wanted to talk, Isabel said quietly, slowly rising to her feet. Her movements were slower than usual, like she was deliberately avoiding anything that might seem confrontational. Elena crossed her arms. You could have called. I thought you'd hang up, Isabel replied, her eyes steady. So I'm here. Please just, let me say it. Elena said nothing, her gaze unreadable. I don't expect you to forgive me, Isabel began, her voice calm but filled with raw honesty. I don't expect anything really. I just want you to know that I see it now. I see what I did. To you. To us. Her voice cracked slightly, but she kept going. I was selfish and I told myself it didn't matter because I was hurting too. But I see now that I wasn't the only one hurt. Elena's jaw tightened, but she stayed silent. I don't want to be that person anymore, Isabel continued. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't let the tears fall. I want to be better. I'm trying to be better. And if you never forgive me, I'll understand. She raised her hands, palms open. But I needed you to hear me say it. Silence stretched between them. Elena stared at her cousin, eyes searching for signs of a lie, for any trace of manipulation. None. Just regret. Real, tangible regret. Words are easy, Isabel, Elena said slowly, her tone measured. I know, Isabel replied, her voice firm. That's why I'm not asking you to believe me right now. Elena's eyes lingered on her cousin's face. The part of her that wanted to punish Isabel battled with the part of her that knew the value of redemption. She exhaled slowly, stepped forward, and extended her hand. Isabel blinked in shock. Her breath caught in her throat, but she reached out and took it. Their hands clasped tightly. Don't make me regret it, Elena warned, eyes fierce. I won't, Isabel said, her grip unwavering. 2 weeks later. Elena sat at her desk, signing a new set of legal documents. Her name was listed as the official legal advocate for the Human Trafficking Survivors Initiative. It was a role she'd never imagined for herself, not in her wildest dreams and certainly not in her worst nightmares. She tapped the paper lightly, feeling the weight of it. This was more than a signature. This was a promise. Her phone buzzed. A message from Adrian. Adrian, congrats, Lion of Justice. Ready to roar? Her lips curled into a faint smile. More than ready. Elena stood by her window, gazing out at the city below. The skyline flickered with distant lights, each one a story, a life, a chance for something better. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass. Once she'd been a bride-to-be. Then she was a woman broken by betrayal. A woman left behind. A pawn on someone else's chessboard. But that was the past. Now she was the one moving the pieces. Her gaze sharpened, her eyes like steel. Her reflection stood as tall as she did, no cracks, no fractures. Oh. Behind her, the glow of her computer screen lit up. The words Human Trafficking Survivors Initiative were bold and clear. Her name was listed beneath it as lead advocate. No more cages. No more chains. Her phone buzzed once more. Another message from Sophia. Sophia, you did it, boss. We're just getting started. Elena replied with one word. Elena, always. She turned back to the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The world was full of shadows, full of unseen threats. But this time she was ready.